Welcome to AEDT 3110U Information Literacy. This is assignment 5, topic evaluation, and the topic I've selected is Black Lives Matters Canada. My name is Sherisse Richards, the professor is Janet Simmons, and the date of submission was December 5th, 2020. First, I'm going to provide a little bit of historical context with regards to the movement. And this is taken from the Black Lives Matters Canada.ca website, December 1st, 2020. So open quote, "In addition to fighting against anti-Blackness, we create spaces to build our community. Through alternative forms of education, programming, events for our communities, and supporting cultural creation, we believe that we can create our own liberation through our commitment to thrive and build beautifully in spite of the ugliness surrounding us." In our movement for Black liberation, we join calls to decolonize Turtle Island and Nunavut Nunganut. Our struggles are tied up with the struggles of the Indigenous people of the land on which many of our ancestors were brought and forced into brutalization, a living apocalypse. There's no Black liberation without Indigenous liberation on Turtle Island. End quote. And Black Lives Matters Canada was founded by Sandy Hudson as well as Janaya Khan. And Janaya Khan is a member of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, queer community, which I will refer to here on as LGBTQ community. So the purpose of Black Lives Matters is to implement change for racialized, marginalized communities impacted by social injustices. So article number 1 is titled, "Why Canada Needs Black Lives Matter." And the author is a lawyer. His name is Anthony Morgan. And the purpose of the article is to persuade readers to believe that Black Lives Matters movement within Canada is integral because Black persons within Canada are racialized and immensely affected by systematic injustices. So Morgan claims that Canada needs the movement because Black Canadians are also being subjected to issues of unjust treatment at the hands, particularly he focuses on the treatment of Black Canadians by law enforcement. And he goes on to give information as follows. According to Morgan, 2020, open quote, "For instance, in Toronto since at least 1978, no police officer has ever served time in prison for killing a Black person, despite the fact that Black people are extraordinarily overrepresented in instances of police use of lethal force." End quote. And I believe that Morgan was successful in his premise because he then goes on to mention actual persons who are Black Canadians who were killed without inquiry or any type of consequence or investigation into the allegation of excessive force being used. So he also concludes, in Canada, open quote, "We have a tragic trend of Black men who have been killed by police with impunity," end quote. That's from Morgan 2020. And he provides those articles he provides those persons' names within the article as mentioned. Alex Loku, Jermaine Carby, Alex Waterfleur, and the list goes on. And those are just a few to mention since 2010. Several questions that come to mind are as follows. I would ask Morgan, what initiatives do you suggest the Black Lives Matter Canada, which I'll refer to as the BLM Canada movement, should implement in order to create successful changes? And so answering this question or examining it would provide insight into how those within the movement can provide more solutions to reduce injustices that Black Canadians face. And question number 2 for Morgan would be, how do you think Canadians can be encouraged, as well as how can they be facilitated in learning more about the plight of Black lives, of those affected by the Black Lives Matter movement? So Black persons, members of the LGBTQ community or of the Indigenous community. How can persons who just want an understanding be encouraged and not feel intimidated? And answering this question would provide answers so that Black Canadians like myself can support my community to become engaged in conversation about the topic so that they would know issues that are a concern for me and I would be able to understand issues that are a concern for them because we all require understanding. The second article is also for the Black Lives Matter movement. However, it's from a different perspective, and it's from author Dr. Louise Potvin, who is a professor at the Université de Montréal, and she's specifically talking to the injustices that are social economic, such as gap wages, less access to education, but her main focus is on healthcare. And she mentions that there are a lot of injustices but we do not have enough data as we should to include the negative systematic health practices that affect racialized persons and those who are a member of the Black Lives Matter movement. And Potman claims that Black Canadians have less access to education, job opportunity, equitable pay, and efficient healthcare. And I believe that Dr. Potvin is successful in her premise and her claims because she also goes on to provide numerous statistics within her article from Statistics Canada that speaks to what she is stating about education not being accessible, job opportunities not being accessible, and equitable pay not being accessible, etc. And here's an example. Data from Statistics Canada displays the following. With regard to annual median salary, the report indicates that the difference in revenue, about $20,000 more annually for men in the general population, between Black men and men of the general population, has remained more or less constant for the entire period and for all groups. And that's from Potvin 2020. According to Potvin 2020, the Statistics Canada report provides an eloquent demonstration. It is time for Canadian researchers to get to work on documenting and analyzing the impacts of systematic racism on the health of Canada's Black populations. End quote. And as mentioned, I believe that she's successful because she goes to outline numerous statistics that all speak to the disparities and disproportionate circumstances that Black Canadians must be subjected to. And she goes on to mention that the systematic injustices in terms of the health system are not properly documented. Questions for Dr. Potvin. What steps can government researchers and other relevant persons take to eliminate these negative systematic practices, in her opinion? Answering this question would provide measurable solutions to improve Canada's health system so that it could be equitable for all. And I believe that's how it would lead to further understanding. Another question that I would ask Dr. Potvin are what tools did she suggest be provided to persons in the medical field, such as physicians, nurses, to assist in treatment of Black Canadians who may feel marginalized or who may feel mistrust due to experiencing systematic health injustices. And I believe this question is pivotal because it provides beneficial tools for medical experts so that they can understand the experience that many Black Canadians feel and members of the BLM movement feel. And then they can learn the necessary steps to take in order to encourage and facilitate fulfilling medical care for all Canadians. Now, the next article takes a different turn. It's against Black Lives Matters in terms of the idea or ideology that it's a movement that is peaceful in nature or required. And this title is Opt-Ed, Politics on Parade, How Black Lives Matter Halted a Gay Pride Parade in Toronto. And the author, he's a journalist as well as a foreign correspondent, and his name is James Kirktrick. And the purpose of this article is to persuade members of the LGBTQ community to question whether or not they really want an affiliation with BLM, based on, he's referring to actions at various events. For example, he also mentions actions at the Pride Parade that was held in Toronto. And so Kirkrick's claim is that the BLM movement is based on, quote, bullying. And he based this above premise for the LGBTQ community to really question whether or not they should view the BLM movement as the issue and to dissociate themselves with the movement. So he kind of throws it out there for them, the LGBTQ community, to ask themselves if they really want to be a part of BLM. And how he does this is by stating in 2016, Black Lives Matter refused to budge unless Pride organizers acquiesced to a list of demands, which included increased funding for Black related Pride events, prioritizing Black trans women in hiring, and a commitment to more Black deaf and hearing ASL interpreters. Surely these issues, which are always demands, never requests, could have been taken up in a more constructive manner before the parade, but dialogue has never been the preferred mode of communication for Black Lives Matter, not even apparently in uber polite Canada. It only took 30 minutes for festival organizers to surrender this bullying. And as mentioned, that's from 2016. Kirktrick. I don't believe that Kirktrick was successful in his claim, and I'll go on to explain that in unison as I ask the questions at a later point. He also states, perhaps now that they're largely won legal equality, gay rights groups feel comfortable affiliating with radical outfits such as Black Lives Matter, but such ideological promiscuity comes with a cost. It's one thing to stand against police brutality. It's another to denigrate an entire city's police force as a reincarnation of Bull Connor. Gay people must ask themselves, do they really want to be implicated with a movement that views the very concept of law enforcement as a racist conspiracy? And as mentioned, that's from Kirktrick 2016. I don't believe he's successful in his claims that the BLM movement is a movement of bullying, because when we look historically at other information provided previously, such as by Dr. Potvin or from Attorney Morgan, we can see that the members of the BLM community, such as racialized group or the LGBTQ, are the ones who are actually victimized, not the bullies. Question one, I would ask Kirktrick is, the article mentions that the BLM movement made requests on behalf of the LGBT community, such as increasing job opportunities for Black trans women. How do you feel that the movement is the problem instead of injustices that are being given, or that injustices that these communities must be subjected to? Why do you believe that the movement is the issue as opposed to the treatment of these marginalized and racialized communities? And answering this question would provide persons from the marginalized communities to be seen that to be seen as the victims, and for people to realize that it's stronger if marginalized communities unite as opposed to being divided, and that there's no need to blame people who feel victimized because it does not add to solving the problem, it only reinforces it. The second question I would ask is what steps he proposes the members of the BLM movement, such as Black Canadians or the LGBTQ community, take, even though they have their own separate community. Because not all members, I'd like to specify, of the LGBT community are a part of Black Lives Matters and vice versa. But what steps does he recommend that these persons take in order to stop unsafe and discriminatory actions that they are systematically subjected to by some police officers? And answering this question would provide engagement for all parties to communicate and to find a healthy solution in a way that promotes understanding, and hopefully be able to change some attitudes and beliefs and therefore harmful practices. And the next article is titled Three People Charged in Toronto Black Lives Matter Protest, Several Statues Defaced. And there are two authors, Brian Aguilar and Phil Tiscoris, and they are content writers for the CTV News in Toronto. The purpose of the statement the purpose statement of the article is to persuade Canadians that the BLM's actions at a protest in Toronto were violent and therefore are harmful to Canada or society as a whole. And so these authors claims that the BLM members that they vandalized Canadian statues and that they engaged in activities that are criminalistic. And how the authors tried to reinforce these claims were by stating Aguilar and Takuris 2020 begin the article stating, open quote, Toronto police have arrested and charged 3 people following a Black Lives Matter protest in downtown Toronto that left several statues defaced, end quote. I do not believe that Aguilar and Takuris are successful or that they were successful in their claims that members of the BLM movement are people who vandalize or that they are criminalistic because of the fact that 3 persons were arrested. We don't know their affiliation with the movement, and overall, the movement seemed to be a peaceful movement. A lot of those statues also have a historical context of being persons who owned slaved or who enslaved persons in the Black community or who created atrocities against racialized individuals. Question number 1. How does generating articles that focus solely on a small byproduct percentage, meaning just 3 persons who were arrested, instead of focusing on the root causes or progresses of the movement, help Canadians overall? So when we begin articles with headlines talking about defaced statues and we blame an entire movement, how does this benefit any person, and how does this create harmony or any positive solution? And this question, it would lead to a further understanding because it allows journalists and content writers to understand that they become actually a part of the problem instead of helping to inform and educate all Canadians about the positive aspects of the movement that occurred that day. They're only helping to foster notions that members of the BLM community are all engaging in criminalistic activity. Question number 2. What responsibility do you believe that journalists or content writers have before writing articles that speak about the actions of historically marginalized groups? I'd like to ask these writers if they believe that journalists or content writers such as themselves have a responsibility to learn about the historical plight of racialized persons that may cause 1 or 2 persons to act out in a certain way or for the whole movement to even have been founded. I'd like to ask them these questions because I believe it leads to further understanding. By discussing these questions, it promotes cultural awareness as well as a code of ethics for journalists to be responsible and held accountable for what they are writing. Here are my references, and thank you so much for your time.